Consider this, a news and information program recorded on the campus of the University of Nebraska at Omaha. From the Fireside Lounge in the Milo Bales Student Center, here is your host, Carol Schrader.
Hi, and welcome back to the University of Nebraska at Omaha. This is really kind of a UNO show. I've asked 3 economics professors from UNO, one of whom is retired, and I might have some temporary flashbacks into some rather hard moments for me when I was taking economics out here, but I thought it's true. Ask Fumi Watanabe, that was the professor's name. I thought I'd ask these professors, Donald Baum, Dr. Donald Baum, Janet West, and retired Dr. Keith Turner. What are the things, because I listen to these talk shows, guys, and it's like mantras. If you're the liberal talk shows, which there are very few of, but there's certain mantras that this is going to give the wealthy, and then there's the conservatives, and there's mantras, and I wonder if after a while I'm not asking the right questions of any tax proposal. So I'm asking you this week about President Bush's tax proposal, and you tell me what questions I should ask and demand answers to, and then you'll help us with some of the answers. Okay? That's asking a lot. Mm-hmm. So let's start with President Bush's plan to end the tax that stockholders pay on dividends, because the theory is that that money is sort of taxed twice because it's taxed as a corporate profit before it's distributed. Am I on the right track here?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to let you hit it first. What are the questions that I should ask?
I think the questions that we're going to ask about all aspects of the tax proposals are, first of all, how much will it stimulate the economy, because it's being sold as an attempt to stimulate the economy to increase spending and avoid falling into another recession. Another question that we should be asking is if it's a fundamental change in the tax system that is going to reduce the amount of revenue collected. What is that being offset somewhere else? If it's not, whose taxes are being reduced and whose are not?
Okay, let's stop with those
distributional effects.
Let's stop. Well, that's really kind of 3 questions.
Yeah.
Because you've got. Let's talk about economic stimulus. I don't think there's any question that one of the things that Bush wants to do, although he seems to be backing off that, is the intent of this particular tax is stimulate the economy, give it a little kickstart. Now that was supposed to happen with the last kind of tax cut, and I think the jury said maybe it didn't stimulate too much. So I'll ask each one of you, will this stimulate the economy?
The dividend proposal in particular. To a small extent, but there are many better ways to stimulate the economy.
Okay, so it won't give us any, we won't feel it. We won't feel the bump.
You'll feel a little bit, but you could get a lot more, a lot faster other ways.
Janet?
Yeah, I would agree completely that because of who is going to be most affected by the possible tax effect, which are going to be the upper income people, and they are not likely to spend in the same way as lower income people. And so we're probably not going to get as much of a stimulus, as Don says, as we would from other kinds of proposals.
Okay, before we move to Keith, and now as I understand it, the dividend, dropping the income tax on dividend, or the tax on dividends, is basically accounts for about half of what is proposed right now in terms of what it would cost.
And that, of course,
or
is
save people, depending on how you look at it.
That's over an extended period of time.
Right.
And so as it was put into effect, then we would see changes in the future, which was going to have much more of an effect upon revenues, and therefore either the deficit or other spending programs. So that, as Don says, I think we have to look at it over the long haul. It's not going to go into effect very soon, and therefore it's not likely to have an immediate impact upon the problems that we're having right now as far as stimulating the economy.
Okay, could it have a negative impact, Keith?
Well, it could. Economists are known for saying, well, it all depends.
Well, let me ask this. When
Don brought up the point that there might be some small stimulus, and Janet brought up the point that there's a time period involved here. And I guess I'm of the view that the stimulus would be very small in the short run. And the short run may be 2, 3, 4 years, because this will take time to to work its way into the economy. So it's not, it's a structural change more than a stimulus.
And you said that's one question that we
Right.
should ask. Does this change the structure?
And that's something that needs to be sorted out in all of this discussion, because it's not necessarily a bad thing to change the structure of the tax system. We're not sure whether this is really a huge, meaningful change or not, but the question is, what's the problem? And the problem to me is that getting the economy going in the short term. If we're arguing that that we need short-term stimuli, this is not going to do much for us.
This is not the thing. It may be a matter of tax equity that should be considered in the context of tax reform.
Broader
Right,
issue.
exactly.
And Don brought up the point that if you cut the taxes on this, now what kind of taxes replace that lost revenue?
Well, I was going to say, this
Yeah.
is not a revenue neutral
Right.
No.
I
kind of
think,
proposition.
revenue neutral by itself.
Carol raised the issue of undesirable effects. I think if you look at the entire package of tax cuts, if it does, it would increase future deficits as structured, that could have a negative impact on the bond market in the sense that it could result in higher long-term interest rates, which would be bad for the economy. I don't know if that's where you were going.
I was going to ask that, because let's say that it even had that little kick that you're talking about, that little bitty kick. Let's say it did that, and so maybe people went out, not right away and in huge droves, bought some stocks that would pay dividends. That means, or big funds or whatever. What would that make that municipalities would have to offer higher yields on their bonds to compete a little more? Could this hurt already strapped municipalities and states possibly in the short run and more than offset that little kick?
Well, I think it would be more of a long run. One of the problems is that it gets so convoluted. All right, so that this is supposed to improve the stock market. All right, well, if it does improve the stock market, then the so-called wealth effect could kick in terms of people feeling wealthier because the stock prices have gone up, and then they're supposed to go and spend more because they feel wealthier. Well, that's a long way down the line in terms of what would be the likely effect. I mean, that could be the
I did that
effect.
before, and I know what happened to my stocks.
Yeah,
So maybe we
so-
would even be a little more hesitant as a group of people and investors now, at least the common people like me, that we'd really have to see some.
But what's the problem right now is the consumers are pretty much still spending by running up credit card debt, et cetera. It's the investment sector. And if the stock market improves, that does not necessarily put money into the corporations. What that does is to put money into those who are buying and selling stock
Regularly,
And so
almost.
then you get into the question that you asked in terms of if it results in long-term debt being estimated, and this has an effect of increasing the long-term interest rate. That, in fact, could discourage investment spending, and so you could end up with actually the opposite result of what is being estimated and forecast into the future. So again, it's got to be looked at from all of these different angles in terms of not only what is the immediate effect, stimulus effect, but also in terms of what would be the likely long-term effect upon investment spending, because the higher interest rates are not going to be favorable in terms of long-term investment.
Well, let me ask you this, you can answer this one first, Keith. If let's say I'm sitting out here and I want to say, George, maybe this is a good thing, Mr. President. Don't want to appear too familiar, but I don't know if that's going to help most of us right now. Maybe it's not a matter of if we do this, because it might make sense, but maybe the timing is off. What else could a George W. Bush offer me as an aggregate American that could kind of jumpstart? Could we help the states out? I know when you give governments money, they spend it right away, and that helps the economy. Could we help the states out with some of the things they're facing, Keith?
Well, before we move to that, though, I think we need to finish that last comment about the potential long-run
Okay, I know you've been dying to
effects.
do that, so go ahead.
Because this is the point that Greenspan made an issue of, that in the long run, it may be good to restructure the tax structure, and maybe cutting down the tax on dividends would stimulate things in the long run. But his immediate reaction was that this would cause deficits, higher interest rates, which would wipe out whatever gains we get from this particular fiscal policy attempt, or perhaps from all of them.
Okay, you get points for
Right.
that, because
Okay.
I should have asked then, what about a deficit and deficit spending when we did have a surplus? I mean, I don't know how much or what. I mean, let's don't get into actual numbers, but we at least had appeared to have the deficit under control and maybe even temporarily wiped out. And I know that's a transitory situation. But what is deficit spending with a war and rebuilding and occupying a country looming? Is that, and baby boomers soon cashing in on their Social Security, which I have a slip of paper that tells me how much I get paid at what ages. Is this good? Should we be a little wary about?
It's a huge collision of all of these things. I mean, we're gonna do the war, the rebuilding, and the advent of the baby boom, retiring. I mean, these things are not necessarily all that many years apart, depending on how long the war and the rebuilding and all that sort of thing takes. But in the meantime, we have the health care costs. Medicare and Medicaid costs are rising in incredible rates.
And we now have a proposed prescription drug program for
Right.
seniors.
And we have other packages and fiscal policy that is aiming toward deficits with no regard to how we're going to pay for all these other costs.
And I'm not making a political
that's,
statement with this. I'm just curious how much.
Well, I would like to go back and pick up on what you were saying, because along with what is being proposed on the tax side is, in fact, a restructuring of the Medicaid, which is a program which is partially paid at the federal level and partially paid at the state
Well, that's
level.
what I was talking about, the
right.
states.
And
The
so
Medicaid
well,
situation is
the
kind of
states-
crazy
I
right
think
now.
we're going a little astray here. We ought to stay on the taxes.
Well, that's why I was generally talking about helping the states, because we
Right.
can't get into that. But I mean, you have a point, and that should be considered. But let's see, what point was I at? Mr. Bush, I respectfully request, given that we're already kind of deficits, and we have baby boomers, and we have a war looming, according to you, pretty close. How much can we deficit spend at this point in our economy, and
Well, I
this trying to
think
come
when
back?
when you're talking about deficits, you have to separate the long run and the short run.
My deficits aren't always horrible.
In the short run, in a weak economy, deficits are not bad, but projecting large deficits forward is not good for the economy. So I think if you're going to have stimulus, you need to do something that will be temporary and not talk about these permanent changes. I think fundamentally, to sum this up, although Bush is claiming that this tax plan is about stimulus, it's primarily not about stimulus. And probably we should talk about the other issues as more important.
Okay, let's talk about some of the other parts of the Bush plan. We've got moving up some of the tax cuts. I think it was scheduled for 2004, 2006, so we want to move those up a little bit. Is that something that we will feel that will help the economy? I mean, I'm sure Mr. Bush feels that he, as a conservative Republican, needs to cut taxes. I mean, I'm not faulting him for doing the agenda that he made very clear when he was running, and he was elected. Whatever you're going to say, he was elected. So he's trying to make good with all these things on some of those promises.
Well, moving up these tax deductions is essentially, giving people money today rather than making them
Part of
wait
that's the
for
marriage
the
penalty and
et
some
cetera.
other.
Yeah, making rather than waiting, saying you'll get your tax deduction 2 years from now, we're saying you'll get your tax reduction today. Well, that would tend to stimulate the economy. Again, the question is one of bang for the buck, because the way that the tax cuts are structured, again, a large lion's share of it is going to go to people in the upper income brackets, and you could get more stimulus in terms of spending by tax cuts that were concentrated perhaps at the lower levels of the bracket or the income levels.
But there's also some equity issues involved, and I know, the point that he makes is that a large percentage of the tax revenues come from the upper income. But by having the kind of proposals that he's coming up with, again, they are so much favored for the upper income. And in a sense, the very lowest aren't able to even take advantage of any of them. Some of the people are making so little money that they aren't paying any taxes. So an increase in the child credit, since it's not a negative income tax, in other words, if your taxes fall below zero and you've got kids, you're not going to get any money. So a person with $100,000 income and a bunch of kids are going to get an extra $400 per child. A family who's trying to survive on $25,000 and the tax is so little and have a bunch of kids, if their taxable income goes below zero or to zero, then they get zero for each of their kids. So again, it's really a mixing of apples and oranges in terms of what's going on.
So what's the question would you pose to George Bush or your senators or congressmen that are, considering this in committee?
Okay, again, it goes back to the question we started with, and that is, what is the fiscal effect? What is going to happen if this tax proposal goes through? What's going to happen to tax revenues? And again, if it's going to reduce tax revenues and we end up with a deficit, and as a result of the deficit, and I know we're going beyond the taxes, but we've got to go beyond the taxes. If they say, well, we've got to get the deficit under control, then there's only one way of doing it. If they've created the deficit by cutting taxes, and now they say we have to do something about the deficit, then the only other thing they're going to do is to cut programs. All right, who is going to be affected by those programs?
I will say, you mentioned Medicaid, and again, I don't want to get off of that, but I just read in the Omaha World Herald a statistic on the increasing number of uninsured. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, those are a little bit not quite apples and oranges, but the economy is such as that many people are being dropped from insurance in their job because their employers can't afford it, or they're moving to part-time. But that is a question, Keith.
Well, the whole Medicare situation and the health care costs in general are a huge problem that aren't addressed at all by any of these fiscal policy measures that we're talking about. I think that if I were to make a recommendation to the president, I would alter these tax cuts that are to be accelerated and brought back from 204 and 206 into the present as quickly as we can. Problem is that we're in the tax season right now for finishing up 202 taxes, so it'd be a year before we could get really much done. But we would move those back, and you could raise the standard deduction and raise the personal exemptions, because that would be a tax break for people that have more children, and many people that there's a lot of children in families that are in low income groups. Okay, so that's one way to get to them partly.
So your question to the president, you said
you need to get money into the hands of the people who are going to spend it, and not into the hands of people who are going to save just more of it.
Well, what about if you're a president that does maybe want to do some stimulus, certainly doesn't want to have a negative impact on the economy, but wants to make some fundamental changes or philosophical changes, because that's what the ground he stood on. It's no big secret. What would you say? Well, George, Mr. President, maybe you should.
Well, I think in terms of the fundamental changes, such as not taxing dividend income, that as far as economic efficiency is concerned, that's a good idea. But the question he has to ask himself is, I'm going to lose X $100 billion in revenue. Okay? How do I either make that up, or how do I, what's the distributional impact of that? Who benefits and who doesn't? And do I want to change other aspects of the system to mitigate that?
Okay, then I'll move to you, and I'll say, as an extension of that, George Bush ran on less spending, less government. So in a way, he's accomplishing one of his goals by kind of not worrying about making that revenue neutral.
Well, except but where we are 2 years later is exactly the opposite. So that when you factor in the increases in defense spending, Homeland Security, which of course is putting a tremendous burden onto the states because they have not appropriated a sufficient amount of money to pick up the local and state costs, but the total amount that is being proposed, and I mean percentage increase, has actually increased. I mean, this is so much like what we had under the Reagan years, where he decreased taxes, increased defense spending, and we ended up with those enormous deficits. And so again, the question is, where is his plan? You know, he's on a different mission. After 9/11, we have had a very different expenditure plan than we had before 9/11.
An agenda that just has to be tended to.
Right, but he's still going ahead with his tax decreases, and at the same time.
Well, you're no big fan of his.
No.
So I mean, so I don't want to look like I've stacked the deck too much, but you're saying that the agenda has maybe shifted a little just
Right.
by happenstance, and certainly not pleasant happenstance.
Now, as far as stimulating, I think the most direct way, and I'm not sure it's exactly the right proposal, but I think the proposal to have a Social Security tax holiday would probably be the most immediate way of stimulating the economy, because most moderate to low income folks pay very little in taxes in terms of income tax. What they pay is Social Security tax. That would put money into their pockets, and they certainly would be spending it.
Keith, can you weigh in on that one?
Well, yeah, I like that idea, because I was thinking about that Social Security tax. Many people pay more in Social Security taxes than they do in income taxes.
Percentage.
And when they look at their
of income.
paycheck, they see their paychecks going down. They don't break out where the taxes came from. People need to look at those W-2s that they have. They'd be startled to find out that, because there's a cap. And so one thing we could do is uncap the Social Security tax. The maximum Social Security tax right now is paid on what, 89.4 or 84.9? I can never.
I think
keep that
Mr.
straight.
W would have a heart attack if he thought you were
Well,
really serious
and
about that.
that would
so
tax payroll taxes on people that make pretty darn good money. That'd be a way of bringing in some revenue to pay for the things that he wants to spend the money on.
Okay, it's your turn.
Okay. I think the idea of fundamental tax reform is a good one, but we should do what we did back in 1986, that is, change the tax system but make it revenue neutral, pick up the additional revenue to cover what we're cutting by closing loopholes. Perhaps if we're providing large tax breaks to the higher income groups, we may even want to look at higher rates for the higher income groups. And also try to make it not only revenue neutral in total, but somewhat distributionally neutral, so that different groups end up paying about the same amount as they currently pay. And at that point, we could do some fundamental tax reform, such as eliminating the double taxation of corporate profits, which would be a good idea.
You know, though, I personally, just kind of looking at it, saying this is a good idea. I don't get a lot of stocks. I have one stock, and Conagra hasn't paid any dividends. And that would kind of make me a little bit happy, but it wouldn't really affect me that much. If any dividends in my 401k that go into that pool, I'm going to pay taxes on them on the other end.
Right.
But what I want to say is, Mr. President, and this just came to me yesterday, what about all these corporate tax loopholes that got us into some of these other messes? I wouldn't mind if you changed this, but maybe we should change some of those other things at the same time. That got us into some of the Enron, I mean, not cause and effect directly, but that climate.
Yeah, the one thing that has happened over time is corporations have gotten very good at avoiding legally the corporate income tax, and that's come about because some of the things that they've done, and also because some of the things that Congress has passed.
Yeah, I thought maybe we could make this revenue neutral.
Right.
If we just found a few little things that kind of push the envelope maybe a little more than the United States people would want if they knew about it.
Right.
And then we could be cool on that.
Well, that wouldn't be that difficult, because what's happened over time is the corporate income tax revenues as a percentage of GDP and as a percentage of corporate profits have fallen because corporations have gotten so good at this game.
In other words, just make that a little more fair, make ours a little more,
Yeah.
us individuals, which I think sometimes are forgotten. We don't want to forget the corporations, they fuel the economy, but make that more fair for individuals, and make that a little more fair across the board for corporations, so that you're competing with
Well, yeah, but you're making a fundamental error
Okay,
there.
I do that all the time.
In the sense of you're separating corporations and people. There's an old saying in public finance: things don't pay taxes, people pay taxes. If you tax corporations,
You're taxing the people.
who own the stock and the people who work there.
Right, but I will tell you just, and I'm not like some flaming liberal, but corporations have a lot more rights than I do in some respects.
They've got better lobbyists.
They're considered individuals in this country, a corporation. As an individual, I sometimes feel,
You're talking
that-
about legal issues there.
well, but just as an entity, you know, as an entity that has a federal tax number, that, you know, just let, you know, put us all, you know, we're not on an even playing field because we're different, but, you know, but, okay, I don't want to get into that. But any other questions I should be asking right now in this time and space, given a war which could be cropping up here even as this program airs?
Well, the big question is how are we paying for the war? Because that hasn't even been factored in.
Now, that's kind of a nasty thing to dump on a president.
The war's not in the budget.
No.
I mean, and we're talking about the deficit of what, 307 million right now, this year, and there's another 60 to 95 billion dollars worth of expenses on the war effort, and possibly continue into some of the early stages of the rebuilding, because we don't know where the later stages of the rebuilding are, and that isn't even in there. So you should put, you know, you should put some projection, some estimate of the war costs into the budget so that it can be carried forward into the deficit. Then we'd have a much better handle of what we're talking about. Otherwise, this is just kind of it's just a strange deficit with a big piece missing out of it.
Well, is that important?
Oh, it's very, very important. In fact, I don't think it's unfair to dump it on George. I mean, it's his decision to go to war. He's got to worry about how to pay for it.
Okay, we have 1 minute left. If you could each spout out the name of things that we want to be thinking people that could read, that has fairly balanced news coverage. I'm not talking about the editorial slant. Spout off a couple of things that we could trust in their news coverage.
News coverage? Well, I direct people to the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and Washington Post. Again, the columns are interesting. The news coverage is good. The editorial pages, we know where they stand.
We're staying away. We know everybody. There's some bias there. Quickly.
Yeah, I think the New York Times and Wall Street Journal, I mean, those are the things that we go to. I would also include Business Week. It's amazing how much information you can get out of that.
Do you have one other suggestion?
Well, Business Week was what was on my mind. Cooper and Madigan write a really good economic analysis every week.
Well, we are out of time. Thanks for that mini lesson. I know you're used to 40 minutes at least to teach. Thank you to Professor Donald Baum, Janet West, and Keith Turner, retired. Thank you for joining us. A little food for thought as we ponder our pocketbooks and our economy. Thanks for joining us. See you next week. And remember, you can see the show on unotv.unomaha.edu. So stay tuned.